What would you do if a singular moment changed your life forever? This Is Actually Happening is a weekly podcast from Wondery that features extraordinary true stories of life-changing events told by the people who lived them. To remember the 20th anniversary of 9/11, This Is Actually Happening is bringing you a special 4-part series called The Long Shadow, with each episode told from the perspective of a person who survived that tragic day. You'll hear from an ER doctor in Lower Manhattan, a Port Authority officer who was near Ground Zero when the planes hit, a firefighter who was on the scene, and a cardiologist finishing his residency who worked in a makeshift morgue. This Is Actually Happening will commemorate the heartbreak, courage, and bravery of the day that changed everything. You're about to hear a preview from episode 1 of The Long Shadow from This Is Actually Happening. While you're listening, follow This Is Actually Happening on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen. You can listen ad-free by subscribing to Wondery Plus in Apple Podcasts or the Wondery app.
Wondery. I come from a mixed background. My father is Nicaraguan and my mother is born in New York, but her father is also Nicaraguan. My trajectory to medicine is a little bit preordained in that my mother's father was a doctor, as was her brother. He got a scholarship to go to Georgetown to study medicine and ended up settling in the United States after marrying my very American grandmother. So my mom is basically a New Yorker who grew up on the Upper West Side, but neither one of my parents wanted to live in the other one's country. So my mother did not like Nicaragua. My father did not like the States, and they settled on Puerto Rico as a compromise. I grew up in Puerto Rico after being born in New York City, and so always had that dual culture of growing up bilingual. Growing up in Puerto Rico was a lot of fun. It was a time when Puerto Rico was really booming. It was all kinds of economic progress and new things happening. So I moved to Puerto Rico when I was 6 years old, and I would spend summers in Jersey City. I would come back up for 1 or 2 months in the summers and spend those with my grandparents. My mother's parents stayed in New York City, and I loved visiting them. Went to the World's Fair in New York when I was a kid, and I could not ever get enough of Manhattan and New York City. When the World Trade Center was being built, I was spending summers in Jersey City across the river and read about how they were built and watched them go up. So as the Trade Center went up, I would read articles about the construction and how it was an architectural innovation in that the strength of the building was in the skin of it. The covering of the building, the outer panels, were where the strength was. And it was considered a pretty innovative design at the time in that it allowed a lot of internal space because it didn't require internal girders like the Empire State Building. So it allowed for much more usable office and gathering space. But it was literally almost in my backyard as it was being built. So it was really fun to watch the whole thing as that area of the city developed. So my dad is from a Lebanese family that immigrated to Nicaragua at the turn of the century. And he was raised in a very strict, old school, old country type of setting. But he is very Latin. He loves the Spanish language and Rubén Darío, the Nicaraguan national poet, and is a fiercely patriotic Nicaraguan. And he is a fish out of water when he's not able to use his Spanish. And so always had that old school, any immigrant family is be a professional, be your own boss, do well in school and keep going. And so his approach to my education in high school was anything below an A+ was really disgraceful. Mom was much more lenient and is a fairly uniquely loving person. Growing up, she was the center of my universe. That I was very close to her, shared everything, told her all my stories. She was the counterpoint to my dad's old school strictness. She gave me that feeling of I could do no wrong. Probably the central reality was protecting my mother. I felt like I was her emotional support, the only son. So it was a pretty powerful gravitational pull that she and I had on each other. I think from my mother, I got a pretty strong sense of compassion. When we lived in Nicaragua, we lived there for a brief period, and beggars would come to the door and she would bring plates of food for them. She was always very compassionate. And I went to a Jesuit high school in Puerto Rico, Colegio San Ignacio, which I adored. It was 6 years and small school, 100 kids in my class, a lot of personal attention and really, really great level of education. And so I was very lucky. We, to whom much was given, would owe something back. And that sense of social commitment was pretty strong. And the Jesuits at the same time were also pretty emphatic about that. Again, I knew in high school I would be a doctor. It wasn't ever in dispute. My father, I think, always felt frustrated that he was not able to be a professional, and he probably would have been a fine doctor. And all those expectations were placed on me. But on the other hand, I felt it seemed like a natural fit, obviously, of if you really do care about social justice and do care about how the world works, then be a doctor and do something about it. Went through high school in Puerto Rico and then came up to the States for college and medical school and have stayed in the States ever since, working mostly in New York City. I hadn't thought a lot about it, but I thought I'd be a family doctor eventually. But I'd always had an attachment to Bellevue Hospital in New York. I'd read a couple of books about being an intern at Bellevue. And the idea of being in the trenches, where everything was happening was very appealing. And so that was kind of my dream choice. the social commitment and dedication at Bellevue, which the motto of that hospital is, we take them all, we treat them all, and this is a world-class hospital, and nobody does it better than we do. It was an amazing place. At the time, it was the early 80s. The Nicaraguan Revolution had just happened. Fourth year of medical school, I'd figured out a rotation to do 2 months in Nicaragua. By then, the Sandinistas were in power, and I wanted to go see it because I'd been there multiple times as a kid and growing up. My dad would take me back and we'd visit family and friends. And when I announced that I was going to Nicaragua, he disowned me. And that pretty much blew our relationship apart, at least for a time. But I loved it. I went to Nicaragua for 2 months and worked in a clinic outside of Managua, and it's incredibly fulfilling, but it also made me want to go back. So my mission in residency was to train myself as best I could, learn all the specialties, because I was going to go back to Nicaragua when I finished. Between 83 and 86, when I did my residency, was when the Contra War was really getting serious. Reagan was hell-bent on crushing the revolution. It was all-out war, and I would obsess on a daily basis of what was going on. So to make money from my adventure, I would do extra hours in ERs in Seattle, which I discovered I really liked. The rapid-fire ER was appealing to me. I knew that me going back down was going to be another nuclear explosion, but I wasn't going to not do it, and I figured I'd deal with the fallout with my father later. And so I met my current wife. We met at a party in Seattle. She's French. And after explaining my own crazy plans, she went back to Paris. And when I graduated from residency, I went to visit her first and then went back to Nicaragua. And I told my parents that I had moved to France. So I would send letters from Nicaragua via Paris that she would then remail as if they were from Paris to make it look to my parents like I was in France, not in Nicaragua.